Our first speaker for today is the name of Bill Konkolesky. He's a state director of the Michigan MUFON Network. He's the author of a book called Bill. Experiencer, Raised in Two Worlds, available on at Amazon.com. What's that? Or that table. You've got the book over there. Great. Please check that out. I myself will probably read that, put that on my reading list. So without further ado, I want to give it over to Bill Konkolesky. Give a warm welcome to Mr. Konkolesky.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'll get out of the spotlight. When I was 18 years old, me and two friends were parked in a Chevette. It was 9 o'clock on a February night, cold night, and we were waiting for another friend of ours to show up. We knew she got off work at 9 and she was going to be home soon. We're just all sitting in his car in front of her place when, at the height of about 2 telephone poles, this blue light slowly arced over the car. It was about the size of a car itself. We all just sat there and wondered to watch this thing go overhead. And then when it got to the other side of us, then a white light zigzagged across the entirety of the sky, just ping-ponged all over the place. Then that disappeared. Then a red light appeared in the middle of the sky and then disappeared. It grew and then it shrank. The three of us all saw exactly the same thing. We were in complete agreement in what we'd seen, and we didn't know what to do about it. One of my friends says, hey, we should tell the police. We're like, well, we're high school seniors. What are we going to do? Go and tell the cops that we saw a UFO? How far is that going to get us? So then the other friend says, well, maybe we should tell Selfridge Air National Guard Base. And I'm like, well, if we're not going to tell the police, we're really going to tell the military about this. So we didn't know what to do. In fact, the next day I went into work, and I decided to tell the closest coworker I saw right when I got into work. And I said, hey, Melissa, guess what? I saw this UFO last night. And she's like, oh, were you with the maintenance man last night? Because he saw this blue UFO fly overhead. I was like, holy cow. Really strange, really an odd synchronicity on top of a strange UFO sighting. So I didn't know what to do with this sighting and just sort of sat on it quietly until a friend in college said, hey, there's this place in Chicago called the Center for UFO Studies. It's run by J. Allen Hynek, the one who was part of Project Blue Book, and now it's his own grassroots UFO investigative group. You should go and tell him. So I have friends in Chicago, so go to Chicago, pay a visit, stop by the Center for UFO Studies, and I say, hey, Dr. Mark Rodiger, guess what? I saw a UFO, and me and my friends, and this is what it was all about. And his response was, well, why don't you tell your state MUFON chapter? I'm like, MUFON, what's that? And he's like, well, we're just a few guys here. I mean, we got all PhDs, we're a smart group, but, we're just a tight-knit unit, and, we do some deep dives on cases for sure, but MUFON, they have thousands of members. They're in every state. You should tell them. And I had no idea. I'd never heard of MUFON before. And I'm going to guess, I don't even need to, I think I ask by a show of hands how many people here have heard of MUFON. Well, okay. Oh, okay, a fair number, thanks. And so I went and I told MUFON, hey, this is my sighting. And this was back in 1993, and I was really impressed by the way they handled what I had to tell. And I felt comfortable saying some of the other things that had happened in my life. And this UFO sighting was by no means the weirdest thing that ever happened to me. And I felt really comfortable sharing more. My presentation is not about my personal stuff, but I did bring a book about my personal stuff if you're interested. Oh, no, they're here. Okay, good. Shoo. Just got to stay quiet and let them go overhead. So this is a really exciting year for UFOs. Coming into this year, I thought, well, this is going to be another year where, the term disclosure is tantalizingly put out there. And maybe there's one, maybe two cool news stories, but it really has been a very interesting year. The Nimitz, the USS Nimitz on the West Coast and its 2004 sightings have been getting a lot of press coverage. The USS Roosevelt on the East Coast, with its sightings from the summer of 2014 through the fall of 2015, it's just an astonishing number of sightings, have been getting play, and they've been, you've been seeing, if you've taken any sort of media, you've probably seen interviews by one of these pilots from one of these aircraft carriers for all of about maybe 10 to 15 minutes before it gets buried in the political news cycle again and disappears. However, a lot of cool stuff has been coming out. There's been a leaked document from the former director of the intelligence agency who tried to find out about black budget projects supposedly dealing with reverse engineered flying saucers. And he was told that he did not have a need to know. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency was told he didn't have a need to know about a black budget project, and he was turned away. And a lot of congressmen and senators have been briefed on the UFO subject, and also there has been a lot of positive media, I think, for the first time that I've seen regarding the subject. The Washington Post surprised me probably more than anything in their May 28th editorial that said, UFOs are real and everyone needs to adjust to that fact. When I saw that headline, I knew the world had changed right at that moment. Maybe a baby step, but I was like, wow, that is really something. And so I don't think the year is done yet with interesting UFO news coming out. And so I'm very excited about what to see next. So for me, since I joined in '93, I've been a member for 26 years. MUFON has been around for 50 years, actually, but I haven't been around for 50 years, so I've been around, though, for more than half of MUFON's time around. In May 31st, 1969, MUFON was founded, so we just celebrated our 50th birthday. I've been the state director for the Michigan chapter of MUFON for 15 years now, which is 3 times as long as anybody else has done it. And then because of that, I run my mouth here and there, goes with the territory. And every once in a while, a TV news production group will contact me and say, hey, you do the UFO thing. Give us some good cases. Give us your insight on some of the things that have been happening. Put us in touch with witnesses that you might know. And then what happens is they take all the information that they give you, they garble it up, they change everything, they make it ridiculous, and then they don't even credit you in the program. And so leaving me to wonder, is it better to not be credited because the product that they ultimately have is pretty bad. And every time, they tease you, they flirt with you. Oh yeah, we just want the straight story. We're going to cover this the right way. But very rarely do they. And so most television about UFOs is garbage by a wide margin. So I also like to start off with this little bit of a brain tickler. There are right now estimated to be about 300 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, give or take. With Hubble and Kepler out there looking for planets, they estimate that about 1 in 6 stars out there may have a potential habitable planet or moon around it. So if you take 300 billion stars, and you say that 1 in 6 of them, of these stars might have a planet with life or a moon with life around it, that's 50 billion stars, or 50 billion, let's say, habitable planets or moons, just in the Milky Way galaxy alone. So you ask yourself, what are the odds that Earth is the only planet that has life with a potential of 50 billion other worlds out there in our galaxy? And if that's not impressive enough, we are able to currently see about 100 billion other galaxies out there. And so you see all these bright lights here on the screen. These are all galaxies. These aren't just single stars. These are all galaxies. Now, say these 100 billion galaxies out there, that the Milky Way galaxy is average, and that each of these galaxies out there has about 50 billion potentially habitable planets or moons. It comes out to 5 sextillion potentially life-sustaining worlds out there. And if you're not impressed enough yet, well, Hubble estimates that with the data that they got, and that there's really about 2 billion other galaxies out there. And, pardon me, did I say billion? I meant trillion. There's 2 trillion other galaxies likely out there. And if each of these galaxies is like the Milky Way galaxy, and let's say it has about 50 billion potentially habitable planets or moons, yeah, you see that big figure up there, 100 sextillion potentially habitable planets or moons in the universe. And then you have to say, what are the odds that Earth is the only planet with life in it if this many planets could have life on it? But then in walks this little thing called Fermi's paradox and says, okay, I'm paraphrasing it here. So you say there's 100 sextillion potentially habitable planets or moons out there. Well, then how come we're not seeing any evidence of any of that life visiting Earth? You would think that some of these planets would have advanced civilizations, that some of these planets with advanced civilizations would be older than the Earth's civilization, and would be spacefaring, and we would see evidence of them. So how come we're not seeing any evidence of it? Take that sort of a thing. Well, MUFON believes that we see quite a bit of evidence, and it comes in on a regular basis, and it's everywhere. There is no shortage of evidence that we're being visited on a regular basis. Just a little quick bit on MUFON. This gentleman up here, he's our international director, Jan Harzan. And then we have about 3,500 members right now. Currently, we're in 43 countries. This guy right here, probably our most famous member, Dan Aykroyd. He's done a lot of TV on our behalf. And when MUFON got fed up with giving information to other TV productions that turned out terribly, we had our own TV series, Hangar 1, for a few seasons. Maybe you'd seen Hangar 1. And then every year we have a big conference. This year was in Irvine, California, to celebrate the organization's 50th anniversary and to pay tribute to Stanton Friedman, who was one of the big leading members of the Mutual UFO Network. Tripping over my tongue, but a great guy as well. And then every month we put out a monthly publication about, guess what, UFOs. So how many UFO reports do we get in? I start with the year 2010 because prior to 2010, we had a different computerized database system, data collection system that had been around since 2000. But when 2010 came around, we jumped from maybe getting a few dozen cases a year to a couple hundred cases a year in Michigan. And the same was true from all around the world, that the numbers jumped up when we perfected our recipe on an online UFO reporting form. And while there are other groups out there that collect UFO information, like the Peter Davenport's National UFO Reporting Center, that is a website that collects data. And this new project from the To the Stars Academy, where they want to also collect UFO data, something I think they call the Vault, they will also collect UFO data. MUFON collects UFO data and then investigates it. So there is no other group out there like MUFON, nearly the size of MUFON, actually investigating sightings. And when we get these hundreds of sightings in every year, yes, we investigate every one. Every one of these numbers represents somebody who actually contacted MUFON independently, submitted a report, and our investigators then looked into it. And there's a couple years here that there is a little bit of a jump. For example, in 2012, we jumped from the previous year's sightings of 279 up to 422, pardon me. That's a big jump. Now, the reason for that jump was that was a big year, the fad of Chinese lanterns or sky lanterns. Essentially, you just get a little candle in a plastic bag and send it up, instant mini hot air balloon. People see them in the sky, they're slow moving, they're flickering, or as some would say, strobing, and people think they're flying saucers, and of course they're not. And when you send up a few of these, and why not? Because they're cheap and easy to send up, people connect the dots psychologically and see a triangle and say, oh my gosh, I saw this big, silent triangle going overhead. It was really, astonishing. I can't believe it. Here's the proof that we're being visited. And, you got to say, no, I'm sorry. And then, in fact, why just send up 3 of these things when you could send up dozens? And then you look and you see dozens of these things flying overhead, and you say, wow, look, here comes the invasion fleet. I got to tell the world about this. So that's what we were dealing with in 2012. So we can identify about 80% of what comes into us. And sometimes when we have a really solid team of active investigators, that number jumps up even to as high as 95% of what people report into us we can identify. But in that, though, is that 5% that is so strange that it cannot possibly be anything explainable easily without introducing the possibility of an extraterrestrial hypothesis. And there was another big jump in 2015, and that was because of drones. That's our new headache, drones, trying to identify drone sighting reports. And then the number of sightings dips a little bit after that because while people in 2010 were comfortable sitting down at a computer, taking 15 minutes of time to submit a UFO sighting, in 2019, if you can't do it with 3 swipes on an app on their phone, they don't want to do it. It's too much time, it's too much effort. And if they're going to submit a UFO sighting report that way, it's not good data. We can't use it. So we're kind of in a pickle right now, in a bind, trying to figure out how to still get good data in and not lose all the impatient witnesses who want to report their sightings. And then beyond just Michigan, worldwide, since 2010, we've had over 70,000 sightings reported just to MUFON, and 56,000 of those are in the United States. And the reason that many are in the U.S. is because MUFON is mostly in the United States, regardless of it being a worldwide organization. So I'm going to cover Michigan's biggest anomalous sighting events, and I start with 1953. Sure, there was the airship sightings of the 1890s and things like that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to cover sightings from the modern era of ufology, which means 1947 or later, 1947 because of the Kenneth Arnold sighting, and also the Roswell event. So starting with 1953, we have a jet fighter and a UFO allegedly colliding over Lake Superior. In 1966, arguably Michigan's biggest sighting event. 1975, a UFO coming down over a nuclear base, Air Force base in northern Michigan. And in 1994, another sighting that had several hundred witnesses. It's the 25th anniversary of that sighting. And then in 2004, I'll touch on my favorite personal investigation. So it was just after the Korean War. This particular event is commonly known as the Kinross incident, if you want to look up more information on it. The Korean War was a time where there was some concern that the Sioux Locks might be targeted by some sort of terrorist activity to try to shut down U.S. shipping lanes, to try to stall the war, and so the U.S. Air Force had bases there just to make sure everything was running smoothly. The Korean War ends in the summer of 1953. The base is still active when on November 23rd, they notice on their radar a big disk that shouldn't be there. It's not going away, and they don't know what to do about it. It's over the Sioux Locks, the very exact thing that has got them, had them so startled during the war. So what they decide to do is they scramble an F-89 Scorpion jet to investigate. And they lose radio contact with the jet as it approaches this disk, which has now flown out over Lake Superior at a speed of about 500 miles an hour. This is not a speed record at that time for aircraft in the world, but nothing that flies that fast, that's that large, should be unaccountable in that area at that time. So the jet is approaching this object, and they're watching it on radar, and the jet gets closer to the object and closer to the object, and then at one point the jet and the object intersect on the radar, and then both disappear forever. Both gone forever. The United States needed a quick story to try to explain what happened, so they said it was Canadian planes that had flown too close to our shores, and they scrambled a jet for that, and then something happened, some sort of mishap happened, and Canada rebuffed them, said, no, don't involve us, we had nothing to do with this. And so then the U.S. didn't know what to do at that point, the Air Force. Now, the two men in the plane, Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson, they were never found again, and they were reported as missing in action. Had they been killed in action, reported as killed in action, as in properly reported as killed in action, then what would have happened is that the family would have gotten better benefits, and the families were already upset by the whole situation. And in fact, during their mourning, the family of Felix Moncla put up a memorial to him down in his home state of Louisiana that said that he had disappeared intercepting a UFO. So the family believes, Felix Moncla's family believed that this involved a flying saucer. And in what's Project Blue Book? Project Blue Book, the Air Force's largest UFO investigation that dealt with the public sightings, lasted 17 years, and this was just a year into Project Blue Book's time. And so they said, yeah, we'll investigate this sighting. So they come in and they do what Project Blue Book always does. They leave out a lot of details. This is the easiest way for them to declare that something is not anomalous by leaving out the anomalous details. To give another just offhand example before I get into this, I know somebody whose sighting was reported in the Project Blue Book files. He was camping out, I forget where it was, somewhere in Michigan, and he and his buddies had seen this weird moving light, and he found some post somewhere where he could call the park ranger station. This is well before cell phones. And he calls in, and a park ranger comes out and sees the UFO and creates this wonderful detailed report that he gives to the Air Force. And how the report appears in Blue Book is that 3 drunk guys around a fire saw some lights in the sky. They leave out entirely the park ranger and his detailed report, and are sure to include the fact that these guys sitting around the campfire were, of course, drinking. So that's pretty much what Project Blue Book does to reports. And in this case, that version came in the form of, okay, you said you saw something on the radar. Tell me, did anybody actually go eyes on with this object? And they're like, well, yes, the pilot. Well, how did the pilot describe it? Well, we don't know because we lost radio contact with him. So Project Blue Book said, well, all you have is something on the radar that was there briefly that you couldn't understand. We'll just call it a temperature inversion, and we're settled. No comment about the plane flying out over Lake Superior and disappearing. And why should it? Because, nobody saw a flying saucer. All they saw was something on the radar. Now, the Air Force also had to do an accident report on it, obviously. And in the accident report, they said it was probably pilot vertigo. The pilot got dizzy, took a dive over Lake Superior, and that's what caused the plane to go down. What the accident report does not include was the fact that there was a flying saucer spotted and the plane was scrambled to investigate it. So in one sense, in one report, Project Blue Book's report, we have that a UFO was mistakenly identified on a radar, but nothing about the plane going down. And then in the accident report where the plane goes down, there's no mention of a flying saucer. So very interesting how this was handled. Now, this story would have gone away pretty much forever, left to people like me, standing on a stage somewhere, reminding people that this is part of our history. Except in 2006, a guy by the name of Adam Jimenez said he belonged to the Great Lakes Dive Company. And guess what? They found not only the plane, but the UFO at the bottom of Lake Superior. These are actual photos that were put out from Jimenez saying, look, this is our proof that we find it. We're claiming salvage rights, and you'll get to find out more about everything when we release our DVD for sale next year. This was kind of hot on the heels of the alien autopsy video, so these guys thought they could make a quick buck. What they didn't understand is that Michigan has had roughly about 100 members in its MUFON group now since at least the 80s. And a group of highly active UFO investigators are not going to sit on their hands and wait for some DVD to come out possibly the next year. They're going to jump all over this. And we did. And within 2 weeks, it was figured out that there was no Adam Jimenez, fake name. There is no Great Lakes Dive Company. The whole thing was a hoax, and they were never heard from again. And the pilots and the UFO were never found. Going down to southeastern Michigan here, this 1966 sighting I put as not only one of Michigan's biggest sightings, but also one of the biggest sightings of UFOs anywhere, at any time, and also a very important part of history in general because of all the working parts and pieces and all the people that were involved in this big UFO frenzy. During 1966, there was a sighting wave that lasted several months. March was the biggest month of this sighting wave, and there was a particular week, March 14th through the 21st, that really took the cake. And I'm just going to take this slice of cake of this particular week to give you a taste of what was going on back then. So starting on March 14th, people were seeing disc-shaped lights and objects flying over the campus of the University of Michigan. They described them as being football-shaped. I thought that was because it was a football town, that they described them as football-shaped, but it turned out people all over the place, all over southeast Michigan, were reporting them as football-shaped. So in this particular case, there were over 100 witnesses this night between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. So in the middle of the night, essentially, there were over 100 witnesses to these disc-shaped lights doing crazy maneuvers all over the place. And amongst these witnesses were police officers, the Hillsdale Civil Defense Director, Bud Van Horn, and also Selfridge Air National Guard Base did track UFOs over Lake Erie that night. The important thing about including the police in a sighting report is twofold. One is that they're considered to be expert witnesses. When a police officer shows up at a scene of an accident, they could determine who's getting a ticket. When they show up to a scene of a crime, their testimony, what they see, could mean somebody's going to jail. They are trained to be objective on the spot, take it all in, and know that everything that they put down on paper is going to matter in a court of law. Expert witnesses. And they also, secondly, basically have a directive to keep the peace. They're not going to excite a situation. They're going to try to find some way to calm it down and make sure that things don't get out of hand. Which makes it interesting when one of the witnesses to the March 14th sighting, Washtenaw County Deputy Sheriff Buford Bushrow, said this to the media. "This is the strangest thing that we have ever witnessed. We would have not believed this story if we hadn't seen it with our own eyes. These objects could move at fantastic speeds, make very sharp turns, dive and climb, and hover with great maneuverability. We have no idea what these objects were or where they could have come from. At 4:20 a.m., there were 4 of these objects flying in a line formation in a northwesterly direction. At 5:30, these objects went out of view and were not seen again." What he could have said was nothing. What he could have said was, "We did see some strange things in the sky, but no idea what they were. We're looking into them." But instead, he comes out and says this, which was not uncommon for police during this sighting wave to come out and say some very specific, very interesting things about what they were seeing. Every night during this week, somebody was seeing flying saucers somewhere over southeastern Michigan. But that being said, I'm going to jump to the next big, really strange night of the week, March 20th. There was a line formation of 5 UFOs seen flying over Ann Arbor when, after passing over Ann Arbor, one of these formation of 5 discs descended over Dexter and descended down into the property of Frank and Ronald Manor. It came down at the edge of their property, and it was a family in their farmhouse. They see this thing come down and actually park. And when they decided to come out, they were not the only ones to actually get a good look at it. Now, here in this picture is J. Allen Hynek, who several days later came out to do an investigation of this as well as other facets of the sighting wave. J. Allen Hynek was the scientific advisor for Project Blue Book at the time, their key guy, and so they had their key guy come out and do the investigation here. And so the father here, Frank, is talking to Hynek, describing what it was that he had seen. Now, among the other witnesses, more police. Police Chief Robert Taylor saw the UFO descend and decided to get a better look at it. So his car is parked at one edge of the property, and he's taking a look at it. And then on another edge of the property, another police car. Washtenaw County Sheriff's Deputies Stanley McFadden and David Fitzpatrick. Here is the police report they took of the Manor family about what they'd seen. And although these 2 officers saw it as well, they do not include themselves, interestingly, in the report. What did it look like? Football-shaped, again, and it had sort of a rough exterior. Frank and Ronald actually only managed to get within a few hundred yards, but did get a good enough look at it to determine its rough size, about automobile-shaped, and it had red lights on it, and it was kicking off this sort of fog underneath. And then Ronald says, "Look at that horrible thing." And as he says that, the UFO gets up, shoots off over Stanley McFadden and Fitzpatrick's car, and with a ricochet sound, shoots off and flies away at high speed. So if you ever have a UFO land on your property, just throw a light insult at it. They're very thin-skinned. They disappear. This picture right here is the actual area where the UFO allegedly came down. I went to the property owner currently, and I asked if he knew where it came down. He says, "Oh, yep." And he pointed exactly to a spot. And then, so I did this little PowerPoint thing on top of it, but this is the actual landing spot. And after the UFO took off, Police Chief Robert Taylor dispatched several police cars to find it and pursue it, which they did apparently. They managed to catch up with it flying down Island Lake Road, and 6 police cars chased this thing apparently down Island Lake Road and didn't catch it. And yes, this is supposedly what it looked like. And then the next night, a night that may have beat all the other nights of the week, on March 21st, there was, at the Hillsdale College in the women's dorm, 17 women at about 10:30 p.m. see this disc-shaped object fly past their window, and it's got different colored glowing lights on it. One of the witnesses, Gidget Cohn was her name, says, "Oh my gosh, this is just like what we've been seeing in the news, these flying saucers." So she's like, "I remember Hillsdale Defense Director, Bud Van Horn, he had said he had seen something too, so I'm going to give him a call," and she did. And he said, "Thank you for calling. If you happen to see anything like this again, please call me immediately." And a half an hour later, his phone rings, and it's Gidget again, and says, "It's back." And not only that, it landed in the ball field, in the baseball field on campus. And so he's like, "Oh my gosh, I'll be right there." And he hops in his car, and he calls the police and says, "You might want to get to Hillsdale. There's apparently a flying saucer landed there." So the police send 3 police cruisers over to the campus. Van Horn goes right to the women's dorm, and he's there now with many more witnesses. Okay, so he's got 87 students now watching this thing, plus the Dean Kelly Hearn, their den mother, and himself make 89 witnesses to a UFO bobbing up slowly up and down on the ball field at Hillsdale College. And they were not with the police cars, and apparently not in contact with the police cars. Again, this is well before cell phones. So they were watching, and anytime, interestingly, a police car got anywhere near the ball field, the UFO would turn its lights off, the police car would pass by, and the UFO's lights would come back on again. And then after a while, the UFO went really up high into the sky at cloud level and started doing this thing where it would hover and then just sort of bounce around the sky, and it got smaller and more distant, and the students peeled off and went to bed, and Van Horn left. And at 5 a.m., Kelly Van Horn was the only one, Gidget Cohn was the only one watching the UFO as it disappeared at about 5 in the morning. So Bud says, "Okay, well, it came down close enough to the ground, possibly landed, let's get some soil samples." And he does, and he says, "Let's get these tested." And depending on the report that you see, either they found some fantastic radiation results, or the people looking at it didn't know what they were talking about, and the results are inconclusive. And in walks the Air Force, and in walks J. Allen Hynek with his marching orders: whatever you do, do not give any impression at all that this is unusual, what people are seeing. Find some way to dismiss it, to explain it, to calm people down, and just sort of try to put this away and have everybody forget about it. And we know this because Hynek went on for years to say that's exactly what he was told to say when he came to investigate. Because when Project Blue Book closed again, he started his own private grassroots investigative organization, the Center for UFO Studies, where he did honest UFO investigation. But during this time, the Air Force controlled what he did and said, and on March 25th, he even had a press conference. And you can find the press conference on YouTube if you look for it. So he's speaking to the Detroit press club, and he starts off with a joke. He's like, "Do you really think a UFO would come all this way from another galaxy just to land in a swamp somewhere?" And like, ha, ha, ha. And he says, that might be what some people are reporting, is like swamp gas or marsh gas. And then the media jumped all over that. Air Force says UFOs nothing but marsh gas. Air Force says UFOs are nothing but swamp gas. So if you ever hear that comment, "Oh, UFOs, there's nothing but swamp gas," it's because of this exact event in 1966 in Michigan. So we are not only the Great Lakes state, we are the swamp gas state as far as UFOs are concerned. And Hynek, oh my gosh, he got teased miserably about this for saying that it was swamp gas. All the cartoons and all the jokes that came out and all the embarrassment, when in fact he really did believe that some of these witnesses were seeing some really fascinating things, some authentic phenomena. But he couldn't say that. So in the follow-up to this, people started writing their congressmen. Say, Congressman, you know, the Air Force is lying to us. The government is lying to us. We're fed up. I know what I saw. I did not see swamp gas. You know, we're being had. We're being treated like children. What are you going to do about it? So at that time, of course, Gerald Ford was one of our congressmen. And he was getting the letters, the phone calls, the visits, you know, the whole 9 yards of people saying, you know, we're your constituents, support us. What's going on with this big UFO lie that the government is trying to feed us, that the military is trying to feed us? So what he decided to do was write a very well-phrased letter and send it to the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Now, there is no evidence that Gerald Ford had any interest in the phenomena. He just wanted his constituents to know that he heard them and then to move on to other things that actually interested him. There have been people that have, within MUFON, that have scoured the Gerald Ford library and have found no interest, authentic interest in his part on the phenomena. But this really nice letter, right? So he says, in the firm belief that the American public deserves a better explanation than that thus far given by the Air Force, I strongly recommend that there be a committee investigation of the UFO phenomena. I think we owe it to the people to establish credibility regarding UFOs and to produce the greatest possible enlightenment of the subject. Beautiful. Sends it off, and the Armed Services Committee says, all right, let's do that. And they agree to have a one-day hearing on UFOs, which turns out to be April 5th, 1966. See, things are moving pretty quickly here. You know, it was the 21st that, you know, we had the Hillsdale sighting. The 25th, he writes his letter. April 5th, they have the Armed Services hearing. So this was getting a lot of attention, the whole phenomena here. And so Hynek, still stinging, still being teased, decides, is there any way out from under this rock that I found myself? And he has what he thinks is a clever idea, because he knows what happens when the Air Force looks at UFO phenomena. He knows what happens when the government looks at UFO phenomena. The Air Force lies about it and tries to lie, you know, try to cover it up. The government doesn't care about it. Again, in the case of this nice letter from Gerald Ford, he just wanted it to go away. So Hynek, at the day's event, said, you know, if you don't like what the government has to say, if you don't like what the Air Force has to say, maybe there should be a civilian group to look into the UFO phenomena. You know, somebody, maybe they could objectively look at it if you think that either of these other groups are tainted. And so the Air Force says, yeah, that's a great idea. In fact, we'll pick out the civilian group. And so very quickly the Air Force announces, we're going to have a civilian group objectively look at our UFO data, and it's going to be the University of Colorado. And they picked the University of Colorado because Edward Condon, the head of the report there that looked into it, he has a lot of government and military ties, no surprise. So they take a look at it, and here he is with a smug smile, UFO paperweight over a stack of papers that are probably UFO reports. And they published something called the Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects. You could probably still find it on Amazon at a good price because they republish it every once in a while. And it's commonly also known as the Condon Report. So this report says, yeah, we looked at the Air Force's files, and we don't think there's anything to this UFO phenomena, so let's just move on. And the Air Force says, well, we didn't think there was anything to this phenomena, And this objective civilian group also looked at our data, and they claimed that there's nothing to it. So we are just going to close the doors on Project Blue Book. After 17 years, over 12,000 cases investigated, 700 of which they still couldn't identify. As much as they tried to mangle the results, they were still too strange to be able to claim that there was nothing to them. But they closed because they said there was nothing further in the interest of science, nothing further in the interest of national security. This 1966 sighting was a real petri dish for the UFO phenomena. You have the government involved, you have law enforcement involved, you have the media involved, you have all the witnesses involved, you have like the Civil Defense Director, you have the Air National Guard catching things on radar, and it was just a big stew of all these different forces experiencing this wild phenomena and not really sure what to do about it. And I think that after this, it was a real lesson to each of these particular groups of what happens during a major UFO wave. Now, if the government and the Air Force said, well, there's no interest in national security when it comes to UFOs, had they been around in 1975, that would have been a much tougher sell. Up here, there used to be an air base in Wurtsmith. It was there till 1993, hosting nuclear bombers, until it became a civilian airport. And somebody told me that the civilian airport, airport just actually closed itself. I'm not sure about that. But in 1975, nuclear bombers. On October 30th, 1975, UFO comes down over the airbase. And it's hovering, this big bright white disk is hovering over the weapon storage area. The guys that are guarding the weapon storage are freaking out naturally. They contact the air traffic tower and say, hey, are you seeing us? And they're like, well, of course we're seeing it. It's right there. And we've even got it on radar. So what are we going to do about this? Now, this base wasn't a base that held a big, squadron of, sleek and nimble jet fighters. These were big, heavy-duty bombers or big, heavy-duty refueling planes. And when the base said, well, do we have anything, scrambling something doesn't seem to be an easy option. Do we have anything in the air? And in fact, there was a refueling plane, a big honking refueling plane coming in for a landing. And they said, hey, do you see this big, do you see this big light hovering over the base? And they'll say, yeah, of course we see that. They're like, well, can you just kind of fly up to it and see what happens? And so the guys on the plane were like, okay, we'll take the orders. And so the plane comes down towards the light, and the light zips away and starts to fly directly south. And the plane is ordered to follow it, which it does at slow speed because, it is what it is. And once it gets, things get far enough so that they lose the light of the UFO in the lights of the shore, they are ordered to come back around. So the plane takes a big loop, comes back headed toward the base. When the UFO flies up, paces it for a few moments, and then suddenly zips up straight into the sky. So, no interest in national security, huh? UFO over a nuclear base in the United States. So what could be even scarier than that? How about over the course of 2 weeks, 4 bases that held nuclear weapons visited by UFOs? It starts in Loring Air Force Base on October 27th. Then the tour goes to Michigan here, October 30th, and then out west to Malmstrom and Minot Air Force Bases right afterwards. And so all of these bases with nuclear weapons had nearly identical UFO reports. So pretty scary stuff. 1994, on the west side of the state, had a UFO sighting wave that in many ways goes toe-to-toe with what happened in the southeastern area in 1966. In this case, one big difference was, although people were seeing the same types of discs glowing, they were seen in formation a lot more frequently than they were being reported in 1966. So people were seeing squadrons and formations of these lights flying together, and even giant objects with glowing lights all the way around them. Like the 1966 sightings, it lasted several months, and like the 1966 sightings, March was a big month for this sighting wave. And like the 1966 sightings, there was one night in particular that was more interesting than the rest of the nights, which was March 8th. So here we have all the circular, triangular, cross-shaped formations. As I mentioned, there were a lot of formations. Over 300 people reported this, so a lot of witnesses, including police, again, expert witnesses. So many calls to 911. If you go online, you could find transcripts of some of these calls to 911. In fact, if you go to YouTube and look up Ottawa County UFO, you'll get to hear a lot of these 911 calls into the police about the UFOs that they were seeing. And the National Weather Service even spotted them, which is strange. And then, did people take pictures and video? Yes, but when you have somebody say, I saw this green disc do these wild maneuvers in the sky, and then they show you the picture of it, and it's 99.5% black, and you see this little teeny streak in the picture, it's not very convincing. Or when they show a video, the video version of that is, again, 99% black screen with the little light moving around, and you can't tell if that's the object moving around or if the person couldn't hold their camera straight. But over 300 witnesses, again, nothing to sneeze at, and the sighting footprint was pretty much Muskegon, Grand Haven, Grand Rapids, Holland, all of this area. The stars, if you will, of this particular sighting wave were the Graves family. This is the actual front page of the Detroit News and Free Press from that time. On March 8th, the family of four, the dad's not pictured here, but the father, the mother, the son who's 14, and the daughter who's 10, all saw this giant disc hovering outside their home with glowing lights all around it. Again, it's such an impressive thing that it made it to the News Free Press front page. The family all described it the same way, Christmas lights around a giant disc. Here's some of the sketches they did for MUFON. All pretty much the same thing. So they call the police, and when they call the police, they dispatch a police cruiser. Officer Jeff Veldhouse shows up at the Graves home. This is the police officer's sketch of what he had seen. He pulls up to the Graves house. He talks to them. He pulls out his binoculars, and he sees not only one giant disc with glowing lights around it, but a second one behind it. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is real, and it's here, and I'm seeing it. And as he's describing it, it flies over the house and his car and starts heading down the street. So he hops in his car to pursue it, see how far he can stay behind it, and watch this thing. And at the same time, the police station's like, oh my gosh, all these 911 calls we got tonight. We actually have a family of four who witnessed it, and we have a police officer who witnessed it. What else can we do to document this? And they call the National Weather Reporting Service, and they get the radar operator, Jack Bush, on. And they ask, hey, are you seeing anything on your radar? And he's like, well, my radar isn't built to pick up aircraft. Anytime we get any sort of aircraft, it's a little pinprick on the screen, and then it disappears quickly. But he says, I'm seeing 3 thumbprint-sized objects on my radar. That means they're absolutely massive, and they're not going in. And he's like, oh, wait, no, there they go. And he said they just all shot off west together at a speed that he estimated to be about 3,000 miles an hour. These things did not appear. They flew out over Lake Michigan. They did not reappear over Indiana. Illinois, Wisconsin, they just disappeared. Did they go up, down, vanish? Nobody knows, but they went out over the lake and they were not seen again. So MUFON was all over this particular case, and several investigators were there covering all the different witnesses and all the different angles. But also the Center for UFO Studies had somebody local, and Dr. Michael Swords out of Kalamazoo. He decided that he was going to be the one on behalf of CUFOS to do the investigation here. So he goes to the National Weather Service and says, hey, I'd like to interview the radar operator. And when he talks to Jack Bushong, he says, Swords says to him, I'd like to see your data. I'd like to see your records. And he says, well, we don't really keep records like that. It's like weather's not that interesting, and we don't keep stuff around for very long. I don't have anything to show you. And Swords says, okay, how about this? How about you sketch what it is you saw? Can you do that? And Bushong's like, well, let me ask my superior. So he comes back and he says, okay, we can do sketches of these, but on one condition. The National Weather Service gets one copy of this, and the Center for UFO Studies gets one copy of this, and nobody else ever sees these sketches ever. And Swords agrees. CUFOS agrees with that, he says. And here are the sketches. I put little red dots to make for visibility. At one point, there looks like there's even 4 of these things, at one time. And the little jagged lines are when something is not quite as clear on the radar as the other ones are, but yep, and before it gets to the next shore. So, if you remember, National Weather Service gets one copy, Center for UFO Studies gets one copy. Nobody else ever sees these sketches, and yet here they are. So a lot of people had thought, well, the Center for UFO Studies, they just couldn't hold on to their data and they had to release it to the public. But no, who knew that the National Weather Service is beholden to the Freedom of Information Act, and you can do FOIA reports on the National Weather Service. So 2 weeks after these sketches were produced, somebody did just that, and they got released to the public. The radar operator, Jack Bushong, very shortly after, was transferred down to Miami. Last I heard, 10 years ago, he was still working down there, and my assumption is he's probably retired by now. So this is the 25th anniversary of this particular sighting wave here. And I'll close out with an investigation that I was a part of during the time when I was doing chiefly investigations. It happened in Highland Township. I was called in March of 2005 about a sighting that had happened over 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 2004. The witness that had called was very shaken up, was pretty much in tears on the phone, describing what had happened to him, and wanted me to come out and investigate at his property. So I said, sure, that's fine. So me and a couple field investigator trainees showed up at his place in, again, March of 2005, 6 months after his sighting. And 6 months after his sighting, he's still emotionally a wreck over what it is he had seen. So you know that he was really affected by it. So we go out to his place, and first thing he describes is on the night of September 29th, he was driving home down some narrow roads, winding roads, tall trees, when he suddenly found himself under a giant triangle. He said it blotted out the stars in the sky, so he knew it was a solid object, had a big red light in the center underneath it, white lights on the vertices, and silent, hovering, still, and giant, he said. And I said, well, what do you mean by giant? He said, well, it was about the size of a football stadium. So he panicked, floored it, went home, and stayed up quite late that night with a lot of anxiety over what he had witnessed. Now, he had something else happen to him the next day, but in between, in the middle of the night and the early morning, people were seeing strange lights in and around Detroit Metro Airport. Here's the airport, and here's where 94 and 275, meet up. And this is kind of the general area where people were seeing lights doing strange flashing and zipping around the sky, doing all sorts of things normal aircraft cannot do. And the witnesses were people that are familiar with the airport. They live in the area, they work near the area, they see air traffic all the time. They know what normal aircraft looks like and what other things that shouldn't be there, that they shouldn't be there. And on Dick Purton's show that morning, he comes on the radio and says, hey, he's doing his morning bit, and somebody calls in and says, hey, did anybody else see those UFOs last night or this morning? And Purton's like, no, but if anybody has, please call into my show. And sure enough, 2 other people call in and describe the same thing on his morning program. So what Purton does is he decides to call the airport on a commercial break. He calls the airport and gets a hold of somebody, says, hey, did anybody else report anything like this to you? And they're like, nope. Do you know what this is? Nope. Any chance you might have caught it on radar? And their response was, well, our radar doesn't go that far. So here's the airport, and here's where the sightings were, and their radar doesn't go that far. So if you weren't afraid to fly before, yeah, exactly. So back to the original witness. It's the next afternoon. He's getting up from an afternoon nap about 3 p.m., and he rubs his eyes. He's in his second floor bedroom, looks out the window, and sees over the tops of the trees at the edge of his property something that looks like a car driving over the tops of his trees. And he gets a closer look, and there's no tires on this thing. It's got 3 portholes on the side. It's about the size of a car, about the shape of a car, moving at about the speed of a car. But what is it? And as he watches, he loses sight of it, and he's still anxious from the night before. Takes a few moments to get himself together, and then he comes downstairs, decides to go downstairs, walks into his kitchen to find it parked in his backyard. Or one just like it, because he did lose sight of it. And it was quite close. I mean, having been in his house, the thing was pretty much parked right outside his window. And it was wedge-shaped, and it had 3 red portholes on it. This is a little mock-up I did. The sketch he did was on pencil on a napkin, and it was tough to see, but I was able to reproduce it. And so he said it was parked in his backyard for an hour. So when that, you start to ask all the obvious questions. So did you take any pictures of it? And he said, well, I didn't want it to think I had a weapon, so no. I'm like, okay. Did you call anybody? And he's like, well, after it was there for several minutes, I thought it might have been stuck. And if I'd have called anybody, it might have thought, well, oh my gosh, it's calling for reinforcements, and who knows what would have happened to me. So I said, okay, what did you do? He said, I sat on the couch and I watched it for an hour. After an hour, it levitated up and flew through the trees and disappeared. And now we had some, what I like to call antique radiation detection equipment with us, but after 6 months, there's no way we're going to pick up anything, especially after trudging through 2 feet of snow through his backyard that was there now, that of course wasn't there in September. There was no way we could even tell where it landed. And so when I brought that up, I'm like, hey, maybe we could come back in a few months and maybe get a better look at your property. And he says, no. He's like, I just told you this to get it off my chest. I don't want to think about it any longer. It's yours now. I'm going to forget all about it. Very credible sounding individual. And he said, I will add this one last thing, that while I was sitting there, within this object there was a big bright red light, and it looked like there was smoke moving around inside of this thing. And I could have swore there were 2 little people like children walking around inside of this. And he goes, the stuff of nightmares, he goes, I don't want to think about this anymore. I'm done with it. And yeah, I haven't heard him tell his story anywhere else. And he was very shaken up. Again, he was tearing up when he was telling us face to face about what happened, and I definitely totally believe him. The one curious thing is the shape of the object that he reported, because it's not a disc or a triangle or a box or even a pyramid, the other things that you sometimes hear reported. It was this very unique shape. Well, it turns out, a few years later, somebody reported this to our Michigan group. When I saw that, I stopped in my tracks and said, that is very similar to what this other guy reported. Black, about the size of a car, about the shape of a car, 3 portholes on the side. The windows were square rather than round with white light. I mean, is that substantial? Or, I mean, sometimes Jeep Wranglers have round headlights. Sometimes they have square headlights. Maybe it was just a different model year of the UFO, you know. But there was some sort of confirmation just a few years later that somebody else saw something very much like it. And in this guy's particular case, he was a truck driver driving through Oklahoma. This thing was pacing his vehicle, and as the expressway took a turn, the object just continued on its straight flight path, and yeah, it really shook the guy up. So if you stick around long enough and you delve deep enough into the UFO database that we've collected over 50 years, you'll find some very interesting correlations between a lot of these sightings, giving further evidence that there is really something to this phenomenon. And they keep coming. People say, well, is there a time of year where you see more UFOs? Not really. Every once in a while you'll get a big wave like the 66 or the 94, but otherwise people see these things all year round. We get 1 to 2, maybe 3 sightings a week into us here in Michigan, and the only slight tiny bump is around the 4th of July. We'll get a couple more sightings then. But otherwise, it's all year round, every year. It's constant, it's persistent. The other important detail, that it's everywhere. Here's a little thing you could do. You can even do this yourself. Go onto the MUFON website and say, hey, give me the last 100 sightings. What you will always get is a population map. Wherever there are more people, there are more UFO sightings. There is none of that some poor lonely guy out in the middle of nowhere saw this thing on Halloween. No, the data very clear in that people are seeing things all over the place. In fact, they had a way to do 1,000 sightings once upon a time, and when you could do that, you could actually trace the expressways through the state. And the same would be true with any state you do, or province, or anywhere in the world. Wherever there are more people, there are more sightings, and it is persistent year-round. Going back to revisit Fermi's paradox, well, you know, you claim that there's this many habitable worlds, so where are all the sightings? Well, in what I do, I am up to here in UFO sightings all year round. It never stops. They're here. It's obvious. It's evident. 80% of what people see at least might be explainable, but still that remaining 15, you know, sometimes maybe even just 5% are some of the strange things that I've covered here already. So if you've seen a UFO, please go to MUFON.com and report your UFO sighting, and an investigator will follow up. If you want to investigate UFOs yourself, go to MUFON.com and learn how to be an investigator. If you are interested in what our state chapter is doing, because we get together regularly, you can train to how to be a UFO field investigator. Go to our state website, mimufon.org. There is information on my table over there with the blue skirt on it about MUFON, about our upcoming event later this month. And then also, it may seem curious that there's a book about abductions also on the table, because as they say with Hair Club for Men, I'm not just president, I'm also a client. So please check that out. I know for the purpose of time, we started a little late. I might have been a bit chatty. So if you have any questions, I'll be an easy target at my table over there. And I'll wrap up now and let the next presenter up here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. Big round of applause for Bill Konkolesky. Michigan MUFON UFO Network. How many people here have had experiences in Michigan or seen some interesting things? Yeah? Oh, wow, that's a lot. How many of you found your experiences to have changed your view of how you see the universe and the world? Would you say? That's quite a few of you. We're glad to have you here. Hope you enjoyed Bill's talk. Bill, if someone wanted to join the the MUFON Michigan Network, can we go to your website? And
Yep, either one of the websites will get you somewhere where you want to be.
Excellent, excellent. I think I may take you up on that. Go to the website. Yep. It's really interesting that there's been so many sightings and viewings in Michigan. I myself, I've never seen anything, but I did hear about one once in the late 70s. Maybe you may have heard about this. There was a radio guy by the name of Mojo, Electrifying Mojo. You might remember him. And he mentioned there was a UFO sighting down by the river. And I thought, oh, that's so cool. Wish I could see it. Looked out my window. I couldn't see it. And fast forward 30 years later, about, 4 years ago, I met a guy just in the course of business. And me, I'm the type of guy that runs my mouth about all this stuff all the time. Spiritual stuff, aliens, people think I'm crazy, whatever. But what happens to me often is that I find people that have had their own experiences, that are waiting for me to come and talk to them so they can get stuff out. In this case, I mentioned to this colleague of mine that I'd heard this radio report of a UFO in Detroit. And he looked at me like he saw a ghost. He said, "Miles, that was over my house that day. I haven't wanted to talk about it in years because it scared the mess out of me." I was like, wow, that's so cool, man. He said it came out of the clouds, hovered over his house, and zipped off. That was about 1978.